Okay, so welcome to our aggregate supply and demand graphing tutorial. This is a graph that you are going to use in almost every assignment, test, etc. for the rest of the summer. This is a graph that takes a little bit of effort to build the first time in your brain, but then hopefully once we get through it, it's something that you can just kind of do as a matter of course. But it does take some practice. It does take some sort of working with the pieces and the parts of it to make sure that you get it precise. So my big note for everybody as we are looking at the summer, a lot of you are doing fantastic work. A lot of you are doing fantastic work where you start a unit the day that it's due. That doesn't give me a chance to give you feedback. It doesn't give me a chance to give you a little bit of help if you're super crazy off the base before you try to take the test, let alone give you a chance to kind of redo it before it becomes late work. So please try to get stuff into me sooner, especially as we get into these more graphing heavy units, which we're about to get into. Because it'll give you a chance to kind of go, oh, I missed that label, oh, I didn't do this correctly, oh, I wasn't really sure about this, and to fix what you're up to. So please take the time to work on that a little bit earlier so that I can get back to you and you can fix things before it becomes a problem. The worst thing that you can do is get it wrong on a practice and then sit down and take your test 20 minutes later and get it wrong on the test and you can't go back and fix that. So I'd rather that you do some assignments, make sure that they're correct, and then go and take the test a couple days later when you're comfortable with what we're up to. Okay, so we have been talking in this class about demand, right? You did supply and demand. They were very, very simple. We did supply and demand. X marks the spot, makes an equilibrium, right? And as a basic graph for the starter of the class. What we are going to do with the graph that we're looking at today is we are going to talk about taking the idea of demand and spreading it across the entirety of the economy. So instead of just like demand for broccoli, we're talking about demand for like broccoli and carrots and shoes and a gallon of gas and a gallon of milk and your electric bill and a t-shirt and everything that you could possibly buy in the entire economy. We call this, and that got cut off on the top, I'm sorry about that. We call this aggregate demand. So SAT word of the day, to aggregate, is to put things together. So we are putting together all of the demand for all of the things in the entire economy when we talk about aggregate demand. So we're kind of shifting away from the single target graph to a graph that's going to look at the entire economy at one shot. So what you're going to do is you're going to have a aggregate demand curve. I'm going to get out like a yellow color over here so we can kind of look at what things are. You're still going to have the same L-shaped axis, but instead of price, if you look over here now, you're going to label it as price level, okay? Because we're not talking about the price of a good, we're not talking about the price of one thing, right? We're talking about the price of all the things, okay? As your quantity measurement, we are going to use real GDP. Okay, so you can label that as GDPR. I personally tend to use RGDP. You can write real gross domestic product if you'd like to, but GDP is going to become the delineator as your quantity measure. Because what we want to look at in the economy is, are we producing at the point where we really want to produce, right? Are we using our resources wisely? Are we using our technology wisely? Are we using our labor wisely? And are we being efficient in that? That's what we're measuring. We're measuring output. How many cars? How many trucks? How much stuff did the economy make? Okay. So from now on, every time you draw a graph, you're going to draw your L-shaped, and you're going to have PL is totally fine. You're going to have our GDP instead of price and quantity. Okay. Aggregate demand is going to look exactly like a demand curve. It is going to go down to the right, and you'll label it AD for aggregate demand. It's very important to have the A there instead of just D for demand. So you'll have price level real GDP, you'll draw your line, and you'll have AD. Wow, I'm drawing with my mouse, so I'm sorry, that's not very clear. So that's what aggregate demand looks like. Okay, that's what our basic graph is gonna look like for us. Now, the easy part about aggregate demand is you go, okay, well, what changes aggregate demand? Remember that aggregate demand is the same thing as GDP, which is the same thing as that really annoying equation that we made you learn a couple units ago, right? Where you had to tell me C plus I plus G plus X minus M, right? So when you're looking at what shifts demand, go to that equation. That equation is going to tell you everything you need to know, okay? So let's walk through it just real quick. Changes in consumer spending. So consumer spending is that C piece. You're going to look at things like consumer wealth, expectations, taxes, debt, things like that. So like tax is a great example. Let's say that President Trump decides to cut income taxes for everybody in the entire country. Well, what that means is that everybody in the whole country now has a whole bunch more money, right? And when you have a whole bunch more money, it allows you to spend it. So what are people going to do? They're going to go spend that money, right? So you're going to see an increase in aggregate demand. On the other side, let's say that we wake up tomorrow and we find out that the stock market has crashed, right? There's been some sort of panic overnight. People are really uncomfortable, and they decide to pull their money out of the stock market. What that means is when that decline in value happens, everybody has less money, so you're going to see a decrease in aggregate demand. Okay, so it literally is just going to how people react to things. Remember the C plus I, the I piece is investment. That is businesses doing things to invest in their business. So we're looking at, am I going to expand my business? I'm going to add a production line. Am I going to hire new labor? Am I going to open up a new location, like a restaurant or, a factory or something like that? And so when businesses change investment, that's going to change aggregate demand. So anything that's going to encourage a business to expand is going to increase aggregate demand. So if you lower interest rates and make it cheaper for me to borrow money, I'm going to go borrow money for my business, and you'll see an increase in investment, which is an increase in GDP, which is an increase in aggregate demand. So all this stuff kind of funnels through itself. So you've got the C plus I. Remember, the G is government spending. That one's probably the easiest part of this. If the government spends, it's an increase. If they don't spend, it's a decrease. So let's say tomorrow morning we wake up and we've declared war on Canada because reasons. We're going to go invade and take all the maple syrup. That is going to be a lot of spending by the government, and they are going to have to dole out a lot of cash. What that means is that when they're spending money, all of that money goes into the economy, and businesses are going to get paid for providing boots and pants and bullets and guns and all the things that our military is going to need, which creates GDP, which is aggregate demand. Okay. On the other side, let's say that we completely cancel Obamacare, we cancel Medicare, we cancel any sort of nationalized health care, and the government stops spending. Well, that decrease in government spending means that we're not putting money out there in the economy, which is a decrease in aggregate demand. Okay. And the last piece of this is a change in exports. You'll see it sometimes as, I like to put this on here because it's different. Either XN is appropriate or X minus M. I usually prefer this one just because it reminds me that there's exports and imports in that number. But what you're looking at is simply, am I importing or exporting more stuff? If I sell more things to other countries, I get cash, and that's awesome. That's going to increase my GDP. That's going to increase aggregate demand because people are demanding things that I can sell them. If I see a decrease in exports, if I'm importing more than I export, I'm buying stuff from China instead of selling stuff to China, well, that means I'm paying money out. So all my money is not going to America, it's going to somebody else. And when that money goes to China, it goes to Bangladesh, it goes to Brazil, to whoever, they're getting the cash. It's good for their GDP. Our GDP will decrease because we're not spending our money on our stuff. Okay? I know that's a lot at one time. Questions for me that far? And like I said before, I'll give you guys all these slides so you've got these all as notes that you can look through later. Okay, if you think of something, type it in the box. Let's keep going here. So we have aggregate demand. Now we got to look at the other side, which is aggregate supply. Okay, so just like aggregate demand, your labels are going to be price level and real GDP on your axes. But in this case, instead of having your aggregate demand line, you're going to have an aggregate supply line. So we're going to have a line that goes up to the left, and you're going to label that as SRAS, the short run aggregate supply. This is aggregate supply today, this week, this month. It is a immediate effect supply line, and we'll talk about a longer term one in just a second. And remember, when you're looking at supply, you're looking at business. You're looking at, is it profitable to produce more of a good? Or are businesses going to look at what's happening and go, nah, this is not for me. I'm not really interested. I'm not going to do it. The one thing that comes into this is, economists call these sticky prices. Sticky prices don't really rise or fall very quickly. A great example of that is income, right? So I'm a teacher. I get a contract once a year that locks in my pay for the entire calendar year, right? So for school year 2019-2020, this is how much you're going to get paid. If you're in, sign on the dotted line, right? If inflation happens during that year, my wages don't change. If something happens in the economy, like we become Venezuela, for crying out loud, my income doesn't change until a year from now. And that's true for a lot of jobs, even hourly wage jobs. It will take a paycheck or two or four to change an income level for people, because people have to recognize that it's an issue, go to their bosses and say, hey, the economy sort of sucks. I need you to pay me more money. The boss has to think about it. They have to decide how much more they're willing to pay. It'll take a while for that to be implemented into a company, especially if they're a very large one or if they're a very small one, because they're going to have issues deciding what to do. So that's what we mean by sticky prices. Some things in the production of goods are going to be a little bit longer term to make some changes, but over the long term, they will change. So just when you see the term sticky prices, that's what we're talking about. Okay, so we've got our short run aggregate supply. Shifters for short run aggregate supply, the best my students and I have ever come up with is IRAP. It's not as easy as just going, hey, it's how you calculate GDP. So let's run through these very quickly. Things that shift supply. The first one is a change in inflationary expectations. What this means basically is, what do I expect the prices to be in the future? If I expect higher prices in the future, I'm going to have some issues, right? I'm going to get more money, but I'm also going to have to deal with higher resource prices to make whatever it is that I make, higher labor costs. I'm going to have to deal with the fact that everything gets more expensive. It's not just that I can charge more for my good, it's that I have to. So you're going to see a decrease in inflation, or I'm sorry, decrease in short-run aggregate supply. If you expect lower prices in the future, businesses are excited. They're like, I can put a car together for cheaper, awesome, and they'll make more cars, and you'll see an increase in supply. The next one is change in resource prices. So this is for a business. Like, I like to tell kids, it's like the recipe for making whatever it is you make, right? So if I'm making a batch of cookies, I gotta have like flour and eggs and chocolate chips and whatever, right? Well, if I'm making a car, the recipe for a car is like, I have to have rubber and steel and glass and wires and a motor and wheels and all sorts of stuff, right? So the resources that it takes to make your product are going to be important, right? So if I'm building a house, okay, one of my resources that I need is lumber. I got to have wood to put up my structure. Well, if there's a change in price of that resource, it's going to change not just for building houses. I'm talking about lumber, right? I'm talking about building houses, building boats, building businesses, doing any sort of building. A change in lumber is a big deal, or like a change in the price of steel from China. A lot of industries use steel. It's going to be a change in the price of, cars, but it's also going to be a change in the price of your pen that has steel in it, your jewelry that has steel in it, your lunchbox that may be made of steel if you've got one of those cool, like, little retro ones, right? Anything that uses steel is going to be affected by that change in price. Okay, so we have inflation expectations, resource prices, so that's our IR. A is actions of the government. I like to focus on the A here, not the G. This is the one place where kids tend to get a little bit confused, because G is government spending and aggregate demand, right? Am I spending money on the military or national parks or education or whatever, right? This is actions. This is things that the government does to influence the economy. So if I put a tax on producers, another great example is a subsidy. So let's talk about like the solar panel industry. The government really wants green energy, right? We really want people to produce solar panels. But they're a fairly expensive good. They're kind of a luxury item these days. And the government wants to make that more accessible. So what do? They give a subsidy, which is basically the opposite of a tax. They're going to go out and they're going to say, I'm going to give you money if you will please make solar panels. So for every solar panel you make that costs you like $500 to make, I'll give you $100. So it's as if your cost is $400, which will increase the ability of businesses to supply it, and they'll get really excited about supplying it, so they will. Other actions of the government, things like regulation. Every time the EPA says you have to inspect your farm, you have to look at the exhaust coming out of a factory, you have to look at the water runoff coming from, whatever. All of those regulations cost money to a business. So let's say we're in Idaho. I own a factory that deals with potatoes. I have to look at the particles of exhaust coming out of my factory. And if it doesn't meet EPA requirements, I'm going to have to install scrubbers that are going to clean that air. I'm going to have to maintain those scrubbers. I'm going to have to deal with the waste that I kind of scoop out of those, which is kind of gross, but it's a thing. I'm going to have to maintain it. I'm going to have to pay for inspections of it. And so those are costs to me as a company. It's not just like, yay, clean air. It's like clean air, but somebody has to pay for it. So those actions of the government are going to affect how businesses can function in the overall economy. The last one here is productivity, and this really is just technology. This is, technology is almost always a really good thing, right? Can I replace a human worker with a robot? Then awesome. Because robots don't take vacations. They don't break an arm. Their kid doesn't get the sniffles, right? They just work. And so it's generally better when you can do that. The only negative technology you might ever see is like, a computer virus destroys half the computers in the entire world, or, some sort of EMP device goes off. But in general, increases in technology are going to be good for productivity. You're going to see an increase in supply for that. It is very rare to see a technology question that is a decrease in aggregate supply. I don't think you'll see one of those in this class, if I remember right. So that's supply. Okay, we're focused on businesses making stuff. So the best thing I can do for you is to tell you to practice your shifters. Do you really know what C plus I plus G plus X minus M do in an economy? Do you really understand IRAP? I put in here for you a little practice thing. You'll see this on the slides, where you can go through and kind of look at and say, okay, there's an increase in consumer spending, right? What is that? Well, that's going to be aggregate demand, because that's the C part of consumer spending. And if there's an increase in consumer spending, it's going to be an increase in aggregate demand. If you can practice those sorts of things, you'll be more successful with these graphs, because you just got to get it natural for yourself. So I stuck that on there for you guys to have as kind of a little mini practice set for yourself, so that you can kind of play around with that. So we got to talk about equilibrium. There is such a thing as short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, which just sounds fancy. All it is taking aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and putting them on the same graph. So things to notice: our labels, our price level, real GDP. Okay, we've got our aggregate demand line, we've got our aggregate supply line. We do have an equilibrium point. Okay, as far as labels for your equilibrium points, I prefer that you label your price level as PL at equilibrium. That tells me that it's your price level at equilibrium. Now, do you see on the GDP line where the label here is Y? You're going to have like a Y at equilibrium. We'll talk about that Y in just a second. It's going to be a unique label for this graph. So all you're going to see on this graph is you're going to see short run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and I can shift things back and forth on this just like any other graph would. right? So if we have an example where, let's say, the government increases taxes for everybody in the entire economy, well, that means that nobody has a lot of cash. So it's going to be aggregate demand shifting to the left. So you'll see aggregate demand, AD2, right? Just like you did with regular supply and demand, you'll see a new, we'll call this Y2, and you'll see a new price level at PL2. So it shifts just like regular supply and demand. Same sort of labeling paradigm. You got to make sure everything's got a label. You've got a directional arrow. You've labeled your axes. You've labeled your equilibrium points. You want to make sure that everything has the right bones to it. The hardest thing for me is to look at a graph from a kid where if you turn me in a graph that looks like this hurts my heart. If you turn in a graph that looks like this, even if you just have the arrow on there, that's a 0-point graph. You have no labels. You have no indication of what anything is. The labels on lines and axes and points are what are going to earn you all those credit points for an assignment. Okay. So we've talked short run aggregate supply, aggregate demand. What we have to talk about now is what happens in the long run. In the long run, price level increases, but GDP really doesn't. Okay, so this is something to kind of keep in mind. In the long run, our economy has a set group of resources. We have the same number of states, the same acres of land to do things on. We have basically the same population. We have the same set of stuff from which to make things. So what we have to add to your graph is something called the LRAS. This is the long run aggregate supply line. And it is going to be a completely vertical line. If you want to be a super nerd, you can put one of these little geometry, I know it's 90-degree angle things on there, but I don't really think that's necessary. Okay, an LRAS line is a vertical line that says this is how much I can make. Okay, this label down here is going to reflect the potential GDP that would be produced if all of your prices and all of your wages were flexible, we're at full employment, we're using all of our resources wisely, we're making really good decisions, everything is good and happy, that's when you're at YF. Now, personally, I like YF because it reminds me that it's full employment. If you are a Google studier, as many kids are these days, you will see people who draw this with Q of Y or Y of P or something. You see lots of labels. But Y will always be in that label, and Y of F is really the standard. You may see in the directions for a question where it says, label your equilibrium Y1 PL1. Then you would label it Y1 instead of YF. So just read the directions on what they want you to do. If they don't tell you, Y of F is what's appropriate. But that line will be a vertical line that's kind of going to be a basis for everything that we do. Okay? Are we being efficient? Are we using our brains to the best of possible? Are we using our resources the best of possible? That is our long run aggregate supply. Okay, so the moment you've been waiting for. Big drum roll. We have what's called a macroeconomic equilibrium. I call it star marks the spot. Okay? This is the full, complete graph that you need to be able to draw off the top of your head. Okay? In this graph, it's everything that we've been looking at. Nothing is different. We've got price level, right? We've got real GDP as our labels on the axis. We've drawn ourselves an aggregate demand. We've drawn ourselves a short-run aggregate supply. And we've drawn ourselves a long-run aggregate supply. And the thing here is just that they all meet at star marks the spot. That's where we know that we're being the most efficient possible. And so we can kind of figure out, is our economy in the right place? Our economy is in the right place if we get to star marks the spot. Okay? This graph looks intimidating. If I just threw this up here at the first, I was like, this is what we're drawing today, your brains would probably melt just a little bit. I like to give kids some tips on sort of getting used to order of operations for drawing this. If it were me, let me give you, let's just do a blank whiteboard real quick. To draw this graph, I would start from the beginning. I would say, okay, I'm going to draw myself a set of axes. And the second I pick up my pencil, the first thing I do is label it. I go price level, and I go real GDP. So that I know I've immediately got that labeled, check it off the list, I don't have to worry about it. The next thing that I'm going to draw, I like to start by drawing my LRAS. I encourage kids to draw that first because it's the line that most kids forget to draw. You'll draw aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, no problem. Aggregate demand is there. You're all set. You're set and happy. But then you forget the LRAS because it's new compared to supply and demand. Okay. But also that gives me a marker for where my economy is supposed to be. So if my economy is functioning on the LRAS, what you're going to find is you're going to find that you'll have my short run and my aggregate demand. Ooh, that was really bad. We're going to pretend like that's just one big dot. They are going to meet on top of long-run aggregate supply, at which point then I can label a price level at equilibrium and a Y at equilibrium, right? So that I know kind of where I'm at. The next thing we're going to start to talk about is to go, well, what if we're not at that long-run equilibrium? Okay, so if we're not at that long-run equilibrium, that's where I go back to, okay, so let's draw ourselves a graph now, right? First thing I'm going to do, price level, real GDP, right? Well, that was really messy. First thing I'm going to do is draw my LRAS, because that's where I want to be, right? But what if I'm presented with a situation where instead of being on star marks the spot, my equilibrium point is elsewhere. So let's say I've got a aggregate supply line that comes here and an aggregate demand line that's here. Well, now what do I have? I have an equilibrium point that is not on my LRAS. So I'm going to have a Y of equilibrium as compared to a Y of F. Wow, that's really hard to draw with my mouse. I apologize. And then you've got a price level at equilibrium. Okay, so in that case, I like drawing the LRAS first because I know kind of where to target my equilibrium point. But also it tells me I'm in a place that's not right. Something is amuck with my economy. Okay, so let's go back to this guy and look at what happens if I'm not on star marks the spot, right? So this is where I want to be. If I'm in a situation like I just drew, where my equilibrium point is out here anywhere to the right side of the LRAS, we call it an inflationary gap. Okay, so in an inflationary situation, output is high. I'm making a lot of stuff. Unemployment is very low. It means everybody's got a job and maybe extra. My actual GDP that I'm spending is way above what my potential GDP probably should be. I like to tell kids it's like driving down a road in your neighborhood, and instead of going like 35 miles an hour, you're going 80. Unsafe. You don't want to be there. You're still going forward, but you want to be going forward a little bit more safely. So we're going to want to do something in our economy that gets us back to our long-run aggregate. Okay, so anything on that right-hand side of the LRAS is going to be an inflationary gap because it causes inflation in our economy. If my equilibrium point is on the other side, I could have a recessionary. So my equilibrium point is over here to the left-hand side. What that means is my output quantity is lower than it should be. My output quantity is not as big as it ought to be. Things are a little bit slow. Unemployment is a little bit higher than it should be. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with what's happening. And so something is muck in my economy. Okay, so I could have a question that starts at equilibrium and then ends up at a recessionary inflationary gap. I could have a question that starts at one of these gaps and then moves back to equilibrium. I could have a question that starts at a gap and something that like makes it even worse. But you've got to make sure that you're starting at the right point. If the question that you got on an assignment or a test or whatever says you start at macro equilibrium, that means you start at star marks the spot, right? But if the question says something like, there's a lot of unemployment in the economy, you got to know in your head extra unemployment means I'm in a recessionary gap, and that's where I need to begin my question. Okay. Just to show you what one of these would look like. So let's say that your question says the economy is currently at macro equilibrium. The government increases spending. What happens to price level and output? Well, government spending is aggregate demand. So you would see a movement from AD to AD1. Your equilibrium point comes over here. And I've created a world where I'm producing more stuff. The price of everything is higher. We've got inflation happening, right? Prices are higher. And so I've created an inflationary gap for myself that I need to figure out how to deal with. That's the next unit, is how to deal with it. This unit is simply acknowledging that we have a problem. Unit 6 will be, now how do we handle it? Okay. So questions for me that far. I know we've gone through a lot of stuff. Is there anything you'd like me to go back and look at? Is there anything that's not super clear to you as we're looking at this stuff? Go back to the recessionary gap. Absolutely, I can. So you want this guy. Yeah, and don't forget, I'm going to give you all of these slides, so you will have these. You can print them out, save them for yourself. You're going to have all of these in your inbox shortly today. Okay, so imports and exports, what effect do they have on aggregate demand and supply? So remember, imports, exports, that's part of that GDP equation, right? GDP is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So imports, exports go in that aggregate demand portion of it. So we know that we're immediately in aggregate demand. And then you have to look at where's the money going, is the easiest way to do it. Is just follow the cash, right? So if I am importing things from China, China gets the money, right? So for China, it would be an increase in aggregate demand. But for us, it would be a decrease in aggregate demand. Because instead of choosing something from the States, I've chosen to buy something from somewhere else. Okay. On the other side, if I'm exporting more stuff, let's say like America decides that we're going to become an oil exporter because reasons, and all of a sudden we're selling oil to the rest of the world. We are selling them oil. They're giving us cash. We get the money. That goes to our aggregate demand. So it would increase our aggregate demand. And welcome back to Jarrett. Popping in and out a little bit. So I'm waiting for them to type for just a second. If you feel semi-comfortable, go forth and have a wonderful evening. That's really all I wanted to make sure we got through. If you have questions, feel free to hang out and ask me. I will be sending you in your email, and I'll put it in the updates, a recording of this session. And I'll be sending you the slides that we put on the screen, so you got those for your notes. And then just feel free to ask me anything you've got, because some kids, you're going to get this the first time through, you're going to feel really confident, you're going to be fine. Some of you guys are going to sit down to do this by yourself and your little brain's going to explode. That's when you need to get in touch with me. Give me a text, shoot me an email, get in touch, and let's kind of figure out where you've gone amok. And just make sure you label everything. Make sure everything's got a label, everything makes sense, and hopefully it goes really well for you. Yeah, absolutely. You're welcome. Yeah, absolutely, Jarrett. No problem. So on this graph, the Q1 and the QY stand for quantity, but could be, yes. So, and again, it's going to depend on, like, if the question asks you to label it in a certain way, they may ask for QY and Q1. You could also label this, for my personal, the way I would label this as Y of F and like Y1. You just need to get into a comfortable graphing paradigm. Whatever that label is, just make sure it's consistent. So check what the question is asking for. If they don't specifically say label it as fill in the blank, then just pick something that makes sense and that you're comfortable with. So don't label it like X or W. It's got to be one of those, Y of F, Q of Y, something standard, and just make sure that they match. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Okay, what shifts the LRAS? Here's the secret sauce. Callie Earl, very good question. So, I think did I stick this on the end for you guys? I did. The only thing that will shift LRAS is investment. Okay? I want you to think about that LRAS. Here's going to be your like ninja mind trick for the day. You ready? Think of the LRAS sort of like a PPF, just straightened out a little bit, right? Where we talked about PPF in that very first unit, and we said that line represents an economy functioning at its very best, right? Using all of the right resources, using all of the labor, all of the smartest stuff that they can do. They're not overextending themselves. They're not slacking off. That line represents excellent economic, practices. Think about the LRAS exactly like a PPF. Okay, so that LRAS is going to stick there. It's going to move basically never, unless you do the things that increase PPFs. Okay, so the best example is an investment in capital stock, right? So I've got a set amount of resources to produce things in my country. If I change those resources in some way, then perhaps it's good for me, right? So if I own a car manufacturing plant and I add a production line to it, and that production line now allows me to produce 50% more cars. Well, now I can produce more cars forever. So that investment in capital stock actually is aggregate demand because I'm investing in my economy, right? But in the long run, I'm also creating more aggregate supply. Okay, this graph might melt your soul a little bit, but let me kind of draw it for you. Let's pick a color that will not blend in here. So in this case, I would have a real GDP. Oh, I hate drawing with my mouse. Price level, right? So I've got my basic graph, right? LR, AS, AS, and AD, right? So let's say I'm a business and I've decided to expand my production lines and make more cars, right? I've bought the robots, I've bought all that stuff. All of that buying is the first thing that happens. So I've purchased all these things. So it'd be AD2, right? And so as I've purchased all this new stuff, I've bought it, I've set it into my thing, I've bought all the bits, parts, and pieces, all the widgets that need to get put together. Well, now that I've purchased something that will allow me to make more cars, what happens in my factory? I'm going to now aggregate supply 2. I'm going to make more cars, right? So I'm going to see an increase in aggregate supply forever because I've enabled myself to make more stuff. Okay, so that is the one case where LRAS will shift. So now, because this is where I used to be, right? And through the course of setting up another production line in my facility, I now have come here. I'm here forever. I can forever make more cars. So this would be LRAS 2. Oh, that's so messy. I'm so sorry. So that's the one case where LRAS would shift. It is very rare. It does not happen often. 99% of the questions that you will see in this class will shift aggregate supply or aggregate demand, not long-run aggregate supply. Okay? To answer the other question I'm seeing over here in messaging, my tutoring sessions are Tuesdays from 9 to 11, so this morning. But we can jump into this tutoring space that we're in right now. We can hop in here literally any time that we want to and share a whiteboard and draw some stuff back and forth. We just need to kind of, whenever schedules match up, we can jump in here and have a chat, go through stuff, you know, have you gonna go, can I draw this and have you look at it or whatever. I just have to be home so I can rig it up on my computer. But otherwise, you're welcome to just get in touch with me and we can talk through stuff whenever. So. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I like to do this graphing session early for this unit, because this is a graph that it's intimidating. It's not the easiest thing that you'll ever do. So yeah, no, you're so welcome. I'm really glad that it helped. So and like I said, you'll have a recording, you'll have the slides, you'll have everything to reference back as you try to go and do work. Okay? You too. Have a good evening.